What is up, everybody? My name is Ben Sauls, and today we're going to talk about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. What do they mean? How can you use them? Let's find out. So to learn about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, which in my opinion are the three most important things to know about your camera, first we must have a little history lesson. So a long time ago, probably around 400 BC, people started to notice this thing called camera obscura. They discovered that when light goes through a small little hole, the image is flipped upside down and retains color and perspective. This is actually how a camera lens works. Then in 1724, Heinrich Schulze, sorry if I mispronounced that, he discovered that substances mixed with silver nitrate respond to light. He discovered this because he had a glass filled with silver nitrate next to a window. When the light came in through the window, the silver nitrate responded. He did notice that it didn't respond near the bottom where the label was covering it up, so he concluded that light created the response. While it was still another 100 years until the camera was invented, this became the foundation for how cameras work. So the oversimplified version of how a camera works is first light is let in through the little small hole in the lens and is reflected back onto this curtain type thing called a shutter. Whenever you take a picture, the shutter opens and closes, letting a certain amount of light in, and it exposes that light to the film. Then when the light is exposed to the film, the silver nitrate in the film reacts to light, embedding that image onto the film. This is pretty much the same process your digital camera will use, but instead of hitting film, it'll be hitting a digital sensor. The film also has these tiny little grain in there, and the bigger the grain, the more responsive it is to light. The size of these grain is where ISO comes into play, or ISO. Big grain will have a higher number like 800, while small grain will have a lower number like 100. The problem with using a high ISO is the larger the grain, the more noticeable it'll be in your footage. This is why in old footage you see all these little spots popping up. You're actually seeing the large grain respond to light. While this process is a little different with a digital camera, the end result will look pretty similar. With the digital camera, the more you raise your ISO, the more these little dots and grain will start to appear on your footage, and your footage will just look really noisy. So to eliminate having to use a high ISO, you need a wide aperture. The aperture is on your camera lens, and it allows a certain amount of light to be let into your camera. Imagine the aperture like a pupil. Whenever it's dark, your pupils get a lot bigger to try and let in more light. Whenever it's bright outside, your pupils get a lot smaller, so everything isn't super bright and overexposed. This is the same way an aperture on your camera works. It works like a pupil that you tell to get bigger or smaller. Now, different lenses will have different widths that your aperture can go to. The width of your aperture is measured in f-stops. The smaller the number your f-stop, for example like a f2.8, the wider your aperture will get. And the larger number like f22, the more narrow and tight your aperture will get. So a good camera lens will have the f-stops of 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and each number you go down, your camera lets 2 times more light in. For example, if you went from an f4 to a f2.8, your camera will let in 2 times more light. This allows you to lower your ISO and have a faster shutter speed, and is the main thing you should be looking for when thinking of buying a lens. Another side effect of a wide aperture is the depth of field. The wider your aperture, the more shallow depth of field you'll have, allowing for that blurry background look. The tighter your aperture, the greater depth of field you'll have, meaning that everything will kind of look in focus. Now that we've learned a lot about what your ISO and aperture mean, now let's learn about the shutter speed. So like I said before, your shutter is like a curtain blocking the light from hitting your sensor or film for a certain amount of time. To decide how long you want your shutter open, you must first find your shutter speed and find the numbers. The numbers represent fractions of a second. The numbers will be anywhere from like 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second. Their fractions stand for how long your shutter is going to be open, allowing light in. The faster your shutter speed is, like 1 2,000ths, the more crisp and sharp everything will look. Everything will look like it's frozen in time. Great for shooting sports or anything with a lot of fast movement. But you do have to remember, the faster your shutter speed, the less amount of time that your film or sensor will be exposed to light, meaning you need to change your ISO and aperture to adjust for that. The slower you make your shutter speed, the more blurry all the moving objects will look. The shutter speed of 1 1/25th is the perfect medium shutter speed. With this shutter speed, you won't be able to capture like fast moving sports, but it won't be so slow that your photo will have camera shake. Camera shake is caused whenever your shutter is open long enough that it captures a slight little movement you make when you take a picture. Once you start to get into slow shutter speeds like anything below 1 1/25th, you're going to start to need to put your camera on a tripod so there's no camera shake. Slow shutter speed is great for shooting at night because your shutter is open for a long period of time, allowing for your image to be more exposed. Really slow shutter speeds like 5 or 10 seconds, you'll start to notice these cool effects like cars having these light trails from the lights moving, people having these ghost effects, or shooting fireworks where it captures all the amount of light that is taken in that photo. Because the shutter is letting light into the camera for 10 seconds, it is capturing all the light that is hitting the sensor at that time. Then if you want to get really cool effects, you can start to shoot with the bulb setting. This allows you to manually decide how long you want to let that shutter open. This is great for like night photography of the stars, drawing with light, or anytime there's a lot of light moving and you want to capture all of that movement. If you want to see more about long exposure photos, click up here where I go much more in depth. One last thing about shutter speed, if you're someone who shoots video, make sure your shutter speed is always double your frames per second. If not, you'll start to notice motion looks kind of weird, and you might even get these weird lines coming through your footage. So now that you have a brief understanding about what aperture, ISO, and shutter speed are referring to, now I'm going to show you where to find them on your camera. So I'm using my Canon 80D, but any Canon DSLR should look pretty similar. So here on the far left we have our shutter speed. Since I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, which is the normal frame rate for video, I'm going to set my shutter speed around 50. Then here in the middle we have our aperture. Now what f-stop I put my aperture at is really dependent on where I am. If I'm somewhere where I can control the lighting, I always try to keep it wide open, as I really like that shallow depth of field it brings. But if you want to see the background in focus too, you can always stop down to like f22 to show off, my new charging station I just created. But for my example, since I didn't really have enough light, stopping down my aperture to f22 didn't let much light in, so I had to raise my ISO all the way up, which is why everything looks so grainy and noisy. When I'm outside, it's normally too bright to use a really wide aperture, and that's why a lot of people invest in ND filters. An ND filter is essentially just like sunglasses that you put on the camera lens, and it allows you to keep that wide aperture without your photo being super overexposed. Now for the last thing, which is on the far right, is our ISO. So I always try to keep my ISO between 100 and 800, because I noticed once I start to go really far above that, everything starts to look grainy and noisy, and I just really don't like it. And that's really about it. Hopefully now you have an understanding about what ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are referring to. To me, they are the most important things to know about your camera. Once you get this down, it'll really get a lot easier and really become a lot more fun. Now just go out, shoot, go see what different settings do what with different images. Just have a good time, be creative with it, and have fun with it. And that's about it for today. If you like this video and want to see more, make sure you like and subscribe. If you want to see my most recent tutorial, click right there. If you want to see my most recent vlog, click right there. And until then, I'll see you next week.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, go!